Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. You're in for a treat. It's my privilege to introduce Bruce Caldwell to you all. Bruce Caldwell got his PhD at UNC, and he's taught at UNC, and he's at Duke currently, teaching at Duke. He's had fellowships at NYU and the LSE. He's a very impressive scholar. He's written literally dozens of academic articles, dozens of book reviews. He's written or edited a dozen books. He is the chief editor of the collected works of Friedrich Hayek, who he's going to be speaking about today, which in itself is a great merit. And he also directs the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke, and that's actually where I met Bruce. When I was in grad school, I came down for a 2-week sort of boot camp, if you will, for grad students and young faculty on different topics in economic history in 2014. Was very impressed with the program and with what he's doing at the center. There's also a journal associated with it. And so he's here to speak to us on the life and ideas of Friedrich Hayek. He'll be speaking from the handout that you have. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Caldwell.
Well, good afternoon. Delighted to be here, Paul. I told Paul at the outset, I usually begin talks like this saying to the students, look, you have got power that you don't know about, and I want you to use this power to demand that you get a history of thought course at your university, because most places I teach, in fact, history of thought isn't there anymore. One reason that we have that center is to try to promote and support teaching of and research in the history of thought. But he told me, I don't have to do that here because you've already got a great course, and he talked a little bit about the curriculum. And I have to say, frankly, it sounds marvelous, and I wish there were more places like that, and you're lucky to have, perhaps not lucky, you're smart to have chosen a school like this to attend. So I commend you all. So I'm just going to tell stories today. That's what historians typically do. And I'm going to tell you stories about Friedrich Hayek. And I got interested in Hayek as an historian of economics for a couple of reasons that I won't go into. But one of the things that I'll point out in the first 10 minutes or so of this talk is he lived, if you take a look at, and by the way, does everyone have a copy of this? Because this will be something that I'll be referring to constantly during the talk. If you take a look on the chronology side, you can see that he was born in 1899 and he died in 1992, and so he's basically contemporaneous with the 20th century. And I thought that studying Hayek would be a wonderful way to get a better understanding of how economics developed in the 20th century, and particularly if we take a look in the first 10 minutes of his biography, of his life and who he was interacting with, we're going to see that he was at the right place at the right time throughout the 20th century, but always with, from everyone else's perspective, the wrong ideas. He was constantly challenging what the mainstream view was. And this then becomes a really fascinating figure because he's constantly pushing back. He's somebody who's got the Nobel Prize, so he's well recognized within the economics profession, but he's also a very strange economist. He doesn't fit with the rest of economics. If you're a mainstream economist, you might have heard of the use of knowledge in society, one of his most famous papers, especially if you're working in the economics of information, you might refer to it. If you're a more popular reader, you might have heard of The Road to Serfdom. But outside of that, he's not, unless you're within a group that actually knows a bit about Hayek, that's about the extent of the contact if you're a mainstream economist. So I'm going to introduce you to Hayek today, introduce you to him and his life, and then on the flip side of that piece of paper, if it's two-sided, I don't know if you had two single sheets, so I saw someone flip. We'll just talk about 5 or 6 of his contributions in various areas, and then I'll just open it up for discussion, questions, whichever way you'd like to go. Okay, so as I said, born in 1899 in Vienna, fin de siècle of Vienna. It was a place and time of great intellectual ferment and creativity in terms of all different disciplines. Psychology, Sigmund Freud was there. Gustav Klimt, one of the an artist that if you've never seen his work, you should look at it, because as soon as you do, you'll be entranced. All sorts of political movements. The Austrian School of Economics was being created. Zionism, in many ways, was born there. Hitler went there to be an artist, and he failed, unfortunately. It's too bad that they were such stringent taskmasters. Otherwise, the 20th century may have turned out a little more pleasant. Anyway, he was born in 1899. He fought in World War I on the Austrian side. After that, he took a degree, went to university. He participated in something called the Geistkreis. This is a discussion group. So you get together with friends. And I just mentioned some of the names there. You may have heard of Haberler. Oscar Morgenstern. This is a classmate of his. He's the person who, with John von Neumann, developed game theory. So if you're doing the social sciences, you hit one of his classmates that he's hanging around with, having discussion each week, is somebody who goes on to invent, as it were, game theory. Fritz Machlup and others. It's also during this period that he experiences hyperinflation in his personal life. Okay, he gets a temporary job, and he's able to actually keep pace with the inflation because of the way his contract was written. But for the vast majority of people, the hyperinflation wipes out their savings. You know, if you've bought a bunch of government bonds and they pay you back after hyperinflation, they've paid you back with nothing. So the entire middle class, it wasn't as bad as it was in Germany, where it basically paved the way for people like Hitler, because the middle class no longer existed after the hyperinflation took off. But this is something that he experienced. And we're going to see that he encounters John Maynard Keynes early on in his career. And I don't like monocausal explanations, but if you think about Keynes is living in England in the 1920s after World War I, when unemployment is stuck in a rut. That was a phrase that he used, at about 10% for all of the 20s, and then in 1929, it suddenly doubles. It gets much worse with the onset of the Great Depression. And so Keynes is dealing with unemployment as a fundamental problem in that period, at the same time that Hayek is seeing the ravages of inflation. And if you think about their respective theories and the approaches that they take to economics, that doesn't explain everything, but it certainly explains some things about their concerns. Okay, so he finished his degree. He goes to the United States. He meets a leading American economist, Wesley Clair Mitchell. This is someone who, if you study history of economics, you might know as one of the fathers of American institutionalism. And he was disturbed by some of the ideas that Mitchell came out with, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. Comes back to Vienna, gets married. He joins Ludwig von Mises's circle. Mises is in many ways a mentor. His book on socialism and also his earlier book on money had a big influence on Hayek. And at some point, I say there Lionel Robbins' invitation. Robbins was behind the invitation. The invitation actually came from the director of the London School of Economics, Lord Beveridge. But he gets invited to give some lectures at the London School of Economics. People told him afterwards that whenever he read from the text, they couldn't understand a word he was saying. But when he would answer questions, it was clear that he was a brilliant person who understood their English monetary theory and other monetary theories much better than they did, so they gave him a job. He enjoyed his time at the London School of Economics and living in England. It really is the place that he felt most at home at. But it's also right from the beginning of his time there that he starts engaging in all these debates with people and disagreeing with people who he encountered in England or encountered their writings while he was a professor at the London School of Economics. The London School evacuates up to Cambridge in 1940 when the London Blitz starts, and Germans start bombing London. John Maynard Keynes gets him rooms there. He writes The Road to Serfdom while he's at Cambridge. I mentioned there, just as a stupid aside, he does air raid duty with John Clapham. Now, why in the world would I put something as silly and stupid as that there? Well, it's because if you look at any of the popular accounts of Keynes and Hayek, you often see the statement or if you saw the Commanding Heights video, it actually starts out, it's a 3-hour PBS or 6-hour PBS series. It starts out with Keynes and Hayek, the outline of their figures on King's Cathedral in Cambridge, on the roof, looking up at the skies, looking for planes, doing air raid duty together. Now, it's one of those facts that are too good to check, because the image of these two masters of economics engaged with each other while they're also helping to protect England is a beautiful image. But I think it's just wrong. Every place that Hayek ever talked about doing air raid duty, he said he did it with John Clapham. Keynes did air raid duty, and Hayek did air raid duty. And I finally talked to Hayek's daughter about this, and she said, well, my memory was that he was up on the roof once or twice, but it's really cold up there. And if you've ever been to Cambridge, the winds off the North Sea come through, and they just rip right through you and freeze you out. So very soon there, after doing that a couple of times, he got a job downstairs in the basement. So the person up on the roof has a phone that calls down to these two people downstairs who then would pass on any information about any planes that might be there. And it's down there that he's having tea with John Clapham sitting by the telephone. That's the air raid duty. So he did do air raid duty, but it wasn't, I think, with Keynes. Maybe it was with Keynes. Who knows? But he never said it. And whenever he talked about it this way. So this is the sort of stupid but interesting things that you can come up with if you end up getting into becoming an historian of economics. Okay, while he's at Cambridge, he publishes Road to Serfdom. Soon thereafter, he also founds the Mont Pelerin Society. After World War II, the people who believed in a free market society and liberal democracy were few and far between, and this was a society of people from all over the world who wanted to be able to just get together and discuss ideas. It wasn't a political organization. It was an organization designed to say, well, let's see if we can, these are the ideas that we believe in. Let's have conversations with each other and see if we can figure out ways to make these ideas more saleable, perhaps, or just what we think of them. What is the proper way to organize a society? So the Mont Pelerin Society still exists today. Meetings take place all around the world. And very important in terms of the rebirth of liberalism. What some people call neoliberalism, I would just call classical liberalism. So if you think about what I've said so far, he comes to England just when Keynes is becoming, John Maynard Keynes, 1936, the general theory gets published. He's already engaging in debates with him. He's interacting with people in the British Academy that end up being quite famous. He goes to the University of Chicago in 1950, just at the time that what's called the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and others are forming. So he was interacting with those people. These are all people that he invited to that first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. He's interacting with that group of people as well. In the late 60s, he moves to Germany. He has a second wife. One reason he moved to the United States in 1950 was to divorce his first wife and marry someone else that he had known from childhood, actually. She was Austrian. I don't think she ever liked Germany. She certainly didn't like Chicago that much. So they moved to Salzburg, Austria. Terrible move. Immediately realized that they'd made, or he realized, I don't know how she felt, but he realized that he had made a horrible mistake. And they moved back to Freiburg. So he spends the last 20, 25 years of his life in German-speaking countries. While he's in Salzburg, he gets the Nobel Prize with Gunnar Myrdal. This is a socialist Swedish economist that he'd known since the 1930s. They always had disliked each other. By this time, they detested each other. And it was almost a cruel joke that the Swedish Academy gave the Nobel Prize to them jointly. But anyway, they did. Neither one thought too highly of the other, but they both accepted the prize. It did cause some tension at the ceremony, though. There's all sorts of stories that I got from his daughter about these sorts of things. Well, that's where he ends up dying. His final book was The Fatal Conceit. This is a book that is a very interesting book because it's hard to tell how much of it's Hayek and how much of it is Bill Bartley, who is the person who helped edit the book at the time. And there's all sorts of stories about that. So let's go over and talk a little bit about his contributions, his intellectual contributions. He started out working and trying to create a model of a capital-using monetary economy. A lot of words there, but trying to figure out how an economy that has money and has capital might work and when it might not work. Now remember, he had gone through that hyperinflation, so he had a particular model. Keynes also, in 1930, published a book, a treatise on money, that had a similar model, and both of their models borrowed from a Swedish economist, Knut Wicksell. Wicksell wrote in German. Hayek, of course, read German. Keynes did not read much German. And Hayek reviewed Keynes's book when he arrived in 1931 to teach at the London School of Economics. And according to Keynes's biographer, the copy of Hayek's review was the most marked up piece of stuff in terms of written things in the Keynes archives. He was absolutely apoplectic about the treatment of his views that he felt Hayek had submitted him to in this review. So within a few months, Keynes publishes a response, trying to defend the arguments that he had made in a treatise on money. Halfway through, he says, well, I may have made some mistakes, but this book by Hayek, Prices and Production, which had just come out, is horrible. It's full of mistakes. It shows how somebody how a splendid logician can start with some wild assumptions and end up in bedlam. Bedlam being a mental institution, basically, for crazy people. So this was unprecedented in academic discourse to have this kind of violence in academic reviews, and this was basically his initial introduction to British academia. Now, having said all that, by the way, they become fairly close friends, and it is Keynes who got Hayek rooms when LSE moved up to Cambridge. He got him rooms in his own college, that is to say, a place to stay while he's teaching students. So they ended up interacting right up until the end of Keynes's life, which is 1946. But at this moment in time, it was quite a violent academic exchange. So what's going on with all this? I don't think it makes sense to go into the details of their respective visions, but we can give a broad general outline. Okay, Hayek is somebody who thinks that markets work pretty well, but sometimes they can go awry, and the loose joint, that was the phrase that he used, is money. Okay, so here's a vision, and if you're an economics major, you might think of a loanable funds supply and demand diagram with an interest rate on the vertical axis and quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis, and the downward sloping investment demand curve, and the upward sloping curve is the supply of savings. If that's helpful to you, fine, but you don't have to be an econ major. What I'm going to tell you should make sense of this. So, savings, okay? When you save for something. What you're doing when you save is you're stopping current consumption because you want something in the future. Maybe you're saving for your retirement, maybe you're saving to buy a car, maybe you're saving to get up enough for a down payment on a house. For whatever reason, you're saving for some future consumption. You're cutting back today to get something more tomorrow. Well, your active savings, if it's matched by millions of other people, if there's an increase in the amount of saving in society, people are putting their savings into the banks. They all are trying to loan it out, but everybody's got this excess money to loan out, so banks start to lower their interest rate. If they lower their interest rate, that induces firms to say, okay, here's a bunch of capital projects, machines and things that enhance the productivity of my workers, that I can now undertake and produce more goods that we will sell in the future. Production takes time. So I'll be able to produce more goods and sell them in the future. So think about that. Savers want more goods in the future, and by savings, they push down interest rates. that induces firms to take actions in terms of increasing their capital stock, that increases the productivity of labor, to be able to produce more goods in the future. The interest rate is a price. Just like all prices allocate resources, movements of relative prices allocate resources, interest rate is a price that coordinates intertemporal consumption when it's working correctly. Okay, that's the vision that Hayek has. Markets, by and large, work. And this is just another example of a market working. If people want more things in the future, this mechanism allows them to have their wishes met. But there's other things that can lower the interest rate. And another thing that can do that is if there's an increase in the money supply. So we could use the same diagram if you're thinking in terms of that diagram, but basically if there's more money that flows into the banks, not from individual savings, but from, say, the Fed increasing the money supply, the exact same sequence happens. Firms see lower interest rates, they undertake capital investments because they want to produce more goods for the future that they know people want to have, but people don't want to have more goods in the future. And once firms recognize that, they feel that they've malinvested, there's been a maldistribution in terms of their decisions about creating more investment goods to create more goods in the future that people aren't going to necessarily want, so they start cutting back, and that's what induces the recession. That's Hayek and the Austrians, the simplified version of Hayek and the Austrians' vision of how a business cycle gets started. And they say when that sort of thing happens, well, yeah, what you want is the recession is painful, but it's really the system returning to equilibrium, getting back to a situation in which changes in interest rates will actually reflect the desires of people in the economy rather than simply being a monetary phenomenon. So this Austrian business cycle theory is something he came up with in the Great Depression, or is enunciating then, and yeah, its policy implications are pretty severe. It's basically saying, well, we got to wait for the economy to get back to equilibrium. And that's not going to sell. That's not going to sell very well. Now, the Keynesian vision, he also saw savings and investment getting out of whack, but he said we can end up having the economy get stuck in an under full employment equilibrium unless we take some action. So his policy recommendation comes out of his model is that you want to have a loose monetary policy, lower interest rates, doing exactly the thing that Hayek would say, if you continue with a policy like that, it's just going to make the problem worse, keep the problem that's been created, make it even worse in the future. So they had very different policy recommendations that came out of their models. And of course, the Keynesian one is one that is saying, well, if we're in a crisis, we're going to do something. So it actually becomes the policy that subsequently, after the publication of the general theory, and through a long series of events, ultimately gets encapsulated in terms of Keynesian demand management policy. So this is one of the first real debates. There was a little bit of a revival in Austrian business cycle theory in the latest downturn, because it seemed what happened in the housing market in the United States seemed to be a beautiful visual representation of the sort of things that can happen. Basically, the Austrian theory says you get into a bad recession when interest rates are held too low for too long, and too many investment projects get started that can't be finished. And if you think of 2008, 2009, where interest rates had been low through the period that came up to that, and then what you saw in terms of housing anyway, were lots of uncompleted houses, basically. You saw housing projects all around Las Vegas that were just stopped right in the middle of operations and were left half-built. And of course, you saw lots of houses that were being flipped, that basically people were buying up houses, 2, 3, 4 houses with the anticipation of simply selling them again at a higher price, because that seemed to be what was going on. So you ended up having a much greater housing stock. We're still paying part of the problem. Part of the problem still exists today in terms of housing stock, because you basically had a construction industry that was wiped out for quite a long period of time. I don't know what things are like. Well, New York's always a very strange case anyway, but in North Carolina, there's actually kind of a housing shortage right now because it's hard to find construction workers, enough construction workers. So many of them exited the industry during the downturn to get things going again. Okay, so that's one area that he participated in. I think monetary theory is the most difficult part of economics, monetary and capital theory. He was trying to put both of them together. But you see echoes of some of his ideas and some of the things that happened recently. And putting together a coherent theory of the cycle is something that I don't know anyone who's done it, but these are two people who contributed to it. So even though this big debate with Keynes was one of the first things that he encountered, really within the first year of being in England, he realized that there was a much bigger issue that needed to be dealt with. And that was the enthusiasm of the British intelligentsia for socialism. Now, socialism, there's been reports that 50% of college students today in America think socialism is great. It's the best system. And you may be some of these students, maybe not. If you're not one of these students and you want to have a good debate with one of these students, what you should ask them to do is to tell you what they mean by socialism, okay? Get a definition first, okay? Because if you just say, well, socialism is everything good and capitalism is everything bad, I mean, you're not going to get very far. So find out what it means. Find out exactly what they're talking about. And this was actually the strategy that Hayek also used. And socialism has a very straightforward definition. It did back then. If you take a look at the Labour Party, socialism is a plank in the British Labour Party, has been since 1918, a party that was founded in 1906. And it's nationalization of the means of production. That is state ownership of the means of production. That's what socialism is. It's not, well, we have lots of social justice. It's ownership of the means of production by the state, getting rid of private firms. And there's lots of rationales for that. If you think that the world is dominated by monopolies and cartels that are able to extract excess profits, well, why not just take them over and those excess profits can be distributed as a social dividend? If there's wasteful competition when these big firms are competing against each other, well, we can eliminate that wasteful competition because if we have state ownership of all these firms, they're not competing against each other, they're cooperating with each other to produce the goods and services that we determine. Okay, so there's lots of arguments that were being made about why nationalization of the means of production is the right way to go. And it was this that Hayek was trying to compose arguments against. And he was in England, and a lot of the English readers didn't recognize that there had been a German language socialist calculation debate in the 1920s that his mentor Ludwig von Mises had participated in. So he made the first argument, and the way he did this was he published a book called Collectivist Economic Planning. It was a book that he edited. He offered an opening introductory essay and then a closing essay talking about the current state of the debate. The first essay was the history, and then in the middle was a bunch of translations of articles by people who were writing in languages other than English that had talked about the problems of socialism. And Ludwig von Mises made one of the most fundamental arguments that he tried to replicate tried to offer to the British readers by replicating or translating the article von Mises. And it goes something like this. It says, well, okay, if the state owns the means of production, that means all the factors of production are state-owned. Where do we get prices, for workers? Where do we get prices for capital goods? Anything that's used in the production process, where do prices come from? And some people like Otto Neurath said, well, we can have a moneyless economy. We don't need prices. We'll just have a central planner deciding what gets produced in what amounts and how it gets distributed. So he said, well, if you don't have prices, you don't know about one of the most fundamental things that are necessary in planning production. It's relative scarcities. If you don't know the relative scarcities of various inputs, how can you combine them in a way that's going to be at all efficient? So this sounds very technical. I'll give you Roger Garrison, who was a person who one of the people who first introduced me, the Austrians, a very homely example. Roger said, okay, the winter's coming, and you live out in the country, and you're going to anticipate a cold winter, so you cut down a bunch of firewood that you want to store, and you don't want it to get wet, because if it gets wet, you're not going to be able to burn it, and you'll be cold. So how will you protect that firewood? And he said, well, there's lots of different things you could do. He says, if you were really cheap, you might just go to Walmart or Kmart and get one of those, not for 99 cents, a piece of plastic, drape it over it, protect it that way. Or you might get a real painter's drop cloth that's much thicker and use that. Or you might actually get some pallets as well and put it up off the ground with that. Or you might build a shed with plywood or maybe even mahogany or titanium. Okay? So at some point, people say, well, of course, you're not going to do that. Well, why not? Because you know the relative prices of these various alternatives. And in making your decision, as consumers, as producers, you weigh your needs, your wants, against the relative prices and come to decisions. What Mises is describing is something where, for an entire economy, you don't have any relative prices about revealing the relative scarcities of all these various goods. You simply have, you might have prices that are set by an authority, but yeah, in a free market, those prices are constantly adjusting up and down according to demand and supply. If you're fixing the prices, yeah, you can even imagine a socialist economy with fixed prices, but they're not adjusting, you'll end up having all sorts of excesses of demand and supply that you can diagram on using your supply and demand diagrams. So this was the first argument against why socialism couldn't work. Now, that was an argument that Hayek translates and reproduces, but by the 1930s, the socialists had come up with lots of other arguments about how their system might work. And there weren't, there was the Soviet example, which a lot of the British thought was pretty good. They didn't think they were that great on liberty, obviously, but they didn't realize this was before the Stalin purges of the later 30s, when it became quite evident exactly how bad things were getting there. And they kind of held out the Soviet example. Well, they support science there. They're doing all sorts of good things there. So they thought that that might be an example, but they were still trying to say exactly how are we going to formulate a system that could overcome this kind of objection. Now, one group of theorists said, well, the latest economics now is general equilibrium theory. This is something originally developed by Walras, refined by people like Pareto and Gustav Casal, and it basically portrays the economy as a giant system of equations. And in a capitalist economy, these equations, in a sense, are solved by entrepreneurs, and in a socialist economy, they're solved by socialist managers. So if we can just direct those socialist managers to act in ways that mimic the benefits of a perfectly competitive environment, we can reproduce the efficiency aspects of a competitive environment without having all the bad distributional and other greed-inducing aspects of socialism. So this was one set of arguments that was being put out there. And Hayek, and I mentioned here economics and knowledge, that's an article that he first started to have this insight about what he called the knowledge problem, that he later finally develops in The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is the paper I would always urge people to consult. He starts there saying, well, this whole general equilibrium framework, it's insightful in some ways, but think about the assumptions it's making about knowledge and information. It's basically assuming that everybody has full information and it's correct. And he said, if you look at the real world, what we've really got are lots of individual agents making their own individual decisions based on their own localized knowledge, localized in time and place. And some of that knowledge is incorrect, some is wrong. They might think it's going to be a very hot summer, so they make lots of equipment for beach balls and such, and suntan lotion. It turns out to be a bad summer, and they don't get to sell any. So people are making mistakes all the time. He says, the real question is, if that's the actual world we live in, why do we see any coordination of actions at all? This general equilibrium world that is being portrayed mathematically seems to assume away all of the things that can cause problems in terms of coordinating. Yet we do see a great deal of coordination out there through a market system. How's it working? And he comes up in Use of Knowledge in Society and other papers with an answer to that question, just basically saying, look, anyone who is interacting in a market, either as a consumer or as a producer, has that local knowledge and is facing an array of prices and is making decisions to try to accomplish some sort of goals, purposeful decisions to accomplish goals as a consumer or producer. They take those prices as given, and they make their decisions, and they realize the prices can change, and they end up having to adjust their behavior as prices change, as things become scarce, as other things become more plentiful. And as they make their decisions, all of those millions of decisions are what create that price structure that they're responding to and constantly interacting with and responding to again. He's basically describing what he later would call a complex order. The price system is a mechanism for trying to organize production, social coordination, in a world of dispersed knowledge. He talks about this as the knowledge problem in his later works and talks about how the price system is a mechanism for helping to solve the problem of social coordination, basically, in a world of dispersed information. Now, of course, he acknowledges, as he had in his earlier work, that introduction of money into an economy like that can cause all sorts of problems, and there are other sorts of problems that we'll deal with in just a second. But that was his vision of how these things work. He points out also that, people are constantly making mistakes, but those mistakes get corrected in a market system. Because if you don't correct the mistake, you go out of business. If you're producing too much of something and people don't want it, you go out of business. In a like manner, it provides incentives to get those things right. You might get it right today, you might get it wrong tomorrow, but if you're going to continue, you need to keep trying to get it right. And by the way, I'll just give you a brief aside. I was lucky enough to travel to Warsaw, Poland, in the early 1980s, before the end of the East Bloc, and saw, for example, if you walk through Warsaw or if you walk through Paris, you will occasionally see kiosks in the middle of the street, not in the middle of the street, middle of the sidewalk. In France, you can buy things like cigarettes, beer, sandwiches, magazines. In Warsaw, they had the thing, it looked just the same, but you walk up to it, and I looked inside, and I saw just rows and rows of dishwasher detergent. And I saw this at all these different kiosks, and I turned to my host. I said, "What's with the dishwasher detergent?" He says, "Well, that's what they're producing." And if you produce too much dishwasher detergent in a capitalist system and it was sitting on your shelf, you'd cut the price and you'd tell them you don't want any more. But this is a socialist economy. The stuff just gets shipped. Look, I do my job. I create dishwasher stuff, and then I ship it out, right? And that's it. And it goes, and they got to put it somewhere, so they put it in the kiosk. It was incredible. And I have lots of examples like that. Until you experience another system, the marvel of the price system is really hard to appreciate. So, I'm going to move very quickly, because according to that timepiece, it looks like I've got about 5 minutes. In World War II, he thought the world was coming. Things didn't look good for England for the first couple of years of the war. Okay, and he thought there was a good possibility that the Germans could win. And so he started on this big project, the Abuse of Reason Project, and out of it comes a bunch of things, one of them being the road to serfdom. But his basic concern in this bigger project was he had been to the United States and seen Wesley Clair Mitchell, an American institutionalist, arguing for progressive economics, where you have the administrative state experts dictating a lot of decisions, constraining markets for the social good. He comes to England, and the Fabian socialist who had created the London School of Economics, where he's working, had very much the same sorts of ideas. As an Austrian economist, he had responded to his education, had been in response to the German historical school, who were conservative German imperialists. They hated socialists, but they introduced many of the same sorts of social programs that would compete with socialist ideas that were being replicated in England and in the United States, or argued for that we should replicate these programs. So he's saying, look, you've got conservative imperialists, you've got American progressives, you've got socialists in England, and they all seem to be saying the same thing, even though they're coming from really different political backgrounds. And the same thing is that we can use science to create a better society, and much of the emphasis, even by those who were opposed to socialism nominally, like the German Historical School, were basically socialist in their orientation. Socialist in the sense not of necessarily recommending nationalization of the means of production, but of heavy government involvement, interventionist within the economy. And he saw even these things that were not socialism as being a road to serfdom, that it would lead down that particular road. That was the argument that he was making during World War II. His book was one of lots and lots of books that were all trying to figure out where things were going to go after the war was over. And he was responding in part to where he saw things going in Britain, and he was right. Basically, the Labour Party took over after World War II was over in England. As I said, socialism in the strict sense is a plank in their party platform. And by 1948, over 20% of the British economy had been nationalized. A lot of firms, a lot of industries had been nationalized. And at that point, they started to recognize that there's some problems with it. And they started to draw back a little bit. But he felt that this was an argument that was being made during World War II. We have pretty much a socialized economy during the war because we're all fighting a war effort. And why don't we just keep this in place when the war is over? These are the arguments that he was responding to then. I'm going to say a couple of words about political philosophy. Many people who read his critique of socialism said, great, you showed us socialism is a good way to go, but capitalism hasn't been doing that great. We just had the Great Depression. What is your ideal society? And in the mid-1950s, he had a couple of speeches that he gave on the ideal of the rule of law. He develops these in more detail in the Constitution of Liberty. And I'll just summarize some of the things that he thinks would constitute an effective liberal order. Excuse me. It's a market system. I'm just going to read these off and then make a comment. You don't have to worry about them. Market system in a democratic polity under the rule of law with the strong constitutional protections of a protected sphere of private activity, well-defined, enforced, and exchangeable property rights, a stable monetary unit, political institutions that distribute power, separations of power between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, bicameral legislature, Bill of Rights, laws, talked about the characteristics of laws being stable, prospective, equally applied and enforced. So he's talking about a general system that he thinks has the best chance of both creating wealth and allowing individuals to pursue their own interests. And I think the way to make these words, again, these words are just so general, come alive is to think about recent experiences in Zimbabwe and certainly most recently in Venezuela. Because if you take these various generic phrases that I've just used and dump each one of them, if you take a look at the histories of those two countries, you will be able to find instances where if you take this as a negative blueprint, get rid of each one of these things. That's exactly what had been happening in that country. Get rid of the stable monetary unit, get rid of the independent judiciary, take over the legislature, put in your own cronies, and see what happens. And Zimbabwe, used to be the breadbasket of Africa, and it just went through an absolutely horrible, horrific time. Venezuela is sitting on untold oil reserves, can't feed its own people. I'm going to stop there because we had a few more things to say. We can talk a little bit about complex orders if you want to later, but I think I've talked enough and I'd like to hear something from you. So thank you very much.